Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence with psychiatrist Bernard David Beitman, MD. Dr. Beitman is the founder of the Coincidence Project. The project encourages people like you to tell each other coincidence stories. To learn more about Dr. Beitman's work, put Connecting with Coincidence in your web browser. You'll find his book, his Psychology Today blog, and the interviews from this podcast. And now your host, Bernard Beitman, MD.
Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence. Yes, I am your host, Bernard Beitman, MD, and we are here to connect you to synchronicity, serendipity, and simulpathity through our ideas about coincidence. Well, what is a coincidence, ladies and gentlemen? What is a coincidence? The dictionary states that a coincidence is a remarkable concurrence of events or circumstances without apparent causal connection. Why is that remarkable? Because they occur at the same time, because a concurrence is surprising, because there's no apparent cause, or there seems to be one maybe, or is there some kind of meaning here? So the definition of coincidence harbors lots of contradiction, and there's the fun. There could be no cause, or there could be a cause. It could have meaning, or there could be no meaning. Coincidences may be both improbable and surprising. Well, these are not synonyms. Coincidences tend to be improbable, but not all improbable events are necessarily coincidences. For example, rolling one dice 6 times and getting the numbers 4, 6, 4, 2, 5, 5 might be improbable, just as improbable as getting 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, but not nearly as surprising. And coincidences are usually surprising. But events that are surprising, like an unexpected firecracker or an unexpected birthday party, are not necessarily coincidences. So a coincidence that is both surprising and improbable captures our attention and demands explanation. In this podcast, we will gather the many threads of coincidence to help us all better understand them and to better use them. Our guest today on this first podcast of this new series is Juliet Trail, PhD. Juliet is founder and director of Courageous Compassion Connection, a nonprofit dedicated to bringing contemplative practices and approaches to diverse groups and individuals in the service of resilience, wholeness, healing, and compassion for all beings. She builds upon more than 15 years of experience in leadership, organizational development, and contemplative education and higher education at the University of Virginia, here in Charlottesville, Virginia. Juliet is the managing director of the Coincidence Project, of which I am the founding director, which is dedicated to advancing the use and understanding of coincidences, synchronicity, serendipity, and simulpathity. She is also a poet and lead singer in a rock and roll band and explores the intersections of creativity and contemplation. She is with us now to talk about the relationship between mindfulness and meaningful coincidences. Welcome to the show, Juliet.
Thank you for having me on the show, Bernard.
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 You British.
My English heritage pops out.
Yes. I will you go ahead and describe a coincidence that you told me about.
Sure. So a coincidence that I had about a month ago was one day away from home running a lot of errands in town. I suddenly had the thought, oh, I wonder how my friend, I'll just say James, wonder how my friend James is doing in New Mexico. And I should really try to give him a call. Maybe when I get home this evening, I should give a call and just see what's happening, see if it's okay. And I, for whatever reason, that popped into my head. So as I was getting home, I went online to just check email and checked on Facebook. And I saw that earlier in the day, several hours prior, his mother had been admitted to the hospital, and he had posted online to his friends to, please be thinking of them and sending their prayers and that sort of thing, because his mother was very sick and he was very worried at the hospital. She was in the intake process. So it occurred at a approximately same time. We're 3 hours apart in time, but my sense of, oh, I'm just thinking about him, I wonder if he's okay, I wonder what's going on in New Mexico, randomly occurred to me. And then it turned out that it occurred near the period of time where his mother was becoming so ill that they had to get her to the hospital. And that's a good example of simulpathity, or having a sense or feeling of a loved one or close friend at a distance. So I thought that was a good one for us to discuss on the show today.
It is. Simulpathity is a concept I've been trying to bring into people's knowledge, because it happens a lot. My research suggests that the feeling of the pain of a loved one with whom you have a connection, an emotional connection, is fairly common. Just talking to one of my patients the other day and brought it up, and she said when she was 7, she woke up knowing her grandmother had died. And she doesn't like to think this way. She's very hard science, but she's open to ideas. So to be able to put in the mind of a 20-year-old supporting an experience she had, which she didn't tell anybody until she told me, is what we're trying to do here. So I appreciate starting with that story, Juliet. Now, how does your mindfulness relate to this kind of coincidence and the other many coincidences in your life?
Yeah, it's been interesting since I'm working on contemplative practice, teaching that, bringing that to different people, and then working with you on the Coincidence Project. I've given it quite a bit of thought in recent months. And at first, they seem like just different things coming from different areas of society right now, a movement towards more meditation and mindful awareness. And then those of us that notice and are really interested in coincidences. But the deeper I thought about it, the more similarities I noticed. So one of the things that happens with meditative practice is that you're training the mind. And with mindful meditation, it's just one of many, many forms of meditation done by different religions and cultures around the world. In mindfulness meditation, you're specifically paying attention in the meditative setting, and you're paying attention to the present moment, whatever arises. And then you're trying to do that without any judgment, with an openness and a curiosity, so that you're just constantly saying, what's here? What is this? And whatever is arising, you're trying to just be aware of it without rushing to judgment, without trying to push it away or latch onto it, or get distracted in a spiral of thoughts, of associations with whatever is arising.
What do you mean by judgment here? Because I think you said a few things, but I think that's such an important word in here, because our brains, our minds are so focused on judgment. So when a thought arises, and you don't do judgment, you said you let it go, or you don't do something with it. You don't get caught up in it. That's the idea of it. But what there's so many other forms of judgment that come in a situation like that. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, and it's part of why meditation is a practice, that we have to practice it again and again and again, because our mind is oriented towards judgment. So training ourselves to allow something to arise, to allow something to be present in our awareness and our consciousness, and not do something with that, not put it in a category of, oh, I'm glad I thought about that, that's really important. Or you notice that you have an old ache returning, and you think, oh, I hate that ache. I don't want to start getting migraines again. Oh, I hope I'm not getting migraines. Oh, migraines have to do with sleep deprivation and high anxiety. What's causing me high anxiety? How well have I been sleeping? So one little twinge that seems like a pre-migraine symptom you notice in your physical experience, and all of a sudden there's a cycle of very rapid thought, categorizing it and making judgments. This is a warning sign. I'm going to get sicker. I'm very worried about that. And that in itself causes greater stress and anxiety, which therefore creates the reality where a migraine is more likely. So whether it's a thought or whether it's a sensation or emotion that arises, a memory, we just so quickly work to associate it with a lot of different information, a lot of different emotion. And it's mindfulness is a practice of trying not to go down that rabbit hole with every thought, with every feeling, but instead to just say, okay, well, I'm feeling a little, pressure at the back of my neck. So what's that pressure like? Feels a little bit like someone pushing on my neck or something, like you might investigate it, but you're trying not to rapidly draw conclusions. And you're trying to be aware of when you start to have a free associations of thoughts that's going to lead you into a quick spiral of assumptions. And instead of having those assumptions, which is kind of another word for judgment, you try to just hold it free of association or assumption or judgment. And you just say, well, this is just what's present right now. And then a moment later, it may be gone. It may not be, a lingering physical experience or even a lingering emotional thought or memory.
Yeah,
And things subside over time without us rushing to hold on to it and then do a lot with it.
yeah, the assumption or the judgment, as you're just saying it, is usually something bad is happening.
Often it's worries. We live in a very worried time, and we all carry a lot of stress and burden and worry for ourselves and for others. So it's easy for something to ping on that, and then all of a sudden we're just in this state of concern, distress, apprehension, and a lot of that is about a future we can't really control. We're making assumptions. This will lead to that. We'll go to this, might do this, and that'll be bad. And so we're casting into a lot of scenarios that where our assumptions are leading to a possible future that we don't like, that we want to avoid. And the mindful awareness is just saying, just notice the present moment. Let go the past, let go the future. What's here now? And then the next moment, and now what's here? And then the next moment, and now what's here? And just trying to stay present. So you focusing the attention and keeping the brain from a lot of emotional reactivity, and you're keeping it from a lot of mind wandering. Because generally, when we're not paying attention to something consciously, all of a sudden we're thinking of this, we're thinking of that, and the thoughts are just, free associating all over the place. And they're often about the past or the future. And so, we drive from one place to another and we arrive and we realize, how did I get here? I don't even know how I got here. Did I drive here? I hope I stopped at stop signs. I hope I didn't roll those stop signs. We can't even remember. We're so lost in that sort of morass of association and thought that, things happen and we just don't even feel like they happen to us. And so mindfulness training is really interesting because it helps ground us in the moment of what we're doing to say, and now pay attention to this. And that ability to be aware of whatever is arising, I think, is part of a skill set that helps us notice coincidences. Because part of what happens with coincidence or synchronicity, simulpathity, serendipity, all of a sudden something arises that relates to something else. And it might be an inner thought relates to something that arises in the outer environment. And we go, oh, that's interesting. I was listening to an audiobook and they were talking about a ship. It was a science fiction story. A ship with a kind of obscure name. It was a Spanish name that I can't even remember, except it started with the letter P. And they were talking a lot about this ship. Oh, it's the Pella. And I pulled up to the gas station, and at the gas station next to me is like Pella and Sons. We'll fix anything you've got. It was some sort of like family business, and it was the same name as the ship. That is so weird. And I just kind of noticed that the audiobook in my car as I was on that trip, and then the first vehicle that I see relate to the same kind of obscure word, this word Pella, which is not something that you hear a lot. And so there was an inner event of kind of processing the audiobook, and an outer event of, here's a truck with the same name. What is that about? How likely or unlikely is that? So it struck me because I was just noticing what was around me.
Yeah,
And I think that mindfulness can train us to notice whatever's coming.
Let's review that, because you said it kind of fast, as is your style when you get excited and you got a lot of stuff to say. And it reminds me of singing. Some of your singing, the way you were just talking, because it goes fast. There's a lot happening. So relate again the Pella. I got to make a joke about Pella in a minute, if I can. Pella. The Pella is what to summarize it. Mind outside, and meditation, and how you're describing mindfulness, how that happened in your mind. And this is for our viewers and our listeners to be able to like slow this down, to see what you were doing, how you had practiced enough so that this was easy for you to do.
Yeah, so I was, on the road for half an hour or so. So I was listening to a good book. And when we're listening to a good book and we need to stop for gas, it's easy to just keep thinking about the book or get lost in new thoughts as we step outside the vehicle, so the book's not playing anymore. And I'm just filling up the car with gas. But mindfulness, I think, has made me more likely to stay present to what's happening around me outside and not just get lost in the inner world of my thoughts. So for a moment, I'm not listening to the book, and I scan the environment, look around, and the first thing I see has the same word that's been repeated over and over in this chapter. There's a big battle on the Pella, and everything's going down, and they keep saying the name over and over. So they'd really said the name a lot. And then I look up, and the first thing I'm reading on the side of a van near me is the same name. And it was kind of an obscure name. So it was like, oh, without the mindfulness practice, I may not have really been taking in the environment of the gas station. I may have just stayed kind of wrapped up in my own thoughts, in that inner awareness, and not really been attuned to my environment. But I was attuned enough to see that, like, oh, here's something interesting. The same word, the Pella, here it is at the gas station.
All right, that's good. You're going to be writing about this for a Psychology Today post that I hope will appear in the next several weeks. And you'll be writing about some of what you just talked about and more. So I encourage our listeners and our viewers to be able to look out for that. If individuals cultivate this inner self-observer that you're implying, and I think I asked you to talk about what an inner self-observer is, and practice mindfulness and compassion, or experiencing coincidences, can we think about being a collective self-observer, that all of humanity might have something to contribute to?
Yes. So that's a big question. There's lots of parts of that. So the first is self-observer. In meditation, some people like to call that inner watching, that inner awareness of what's arising, an observer. Others don't like that. They feel like it's too creating an us, them, and otherness inside, and they don't like that. They feel like it's a false separation. But I think it's very convenient to use the term, at least to kind of describe the process as we're meditating. Something arises and we become aware of it. So who is this one that becomes aware? So there's an interesting sound in our environment as we're meditating. And then there's a thought, I wish it was quiet, because meditation is supposed to be tranquil. And that sounds annoying. Let's say it's a leaf blower nearby. So then there starts this conversation between sort of two things. One who's just perceiving the leaf blower, and then this other voice begins to narrate with thoughts about that. And then the one that was trying to do mindfulness meditation might shush the voice and just say, we're not trying to draw judgments about this. We're just letting it be. It's just a leaf blower. Take in the sound. And so that is kind of an observing self that can be a little bit of a therapist or coach self, telling the one that wants to be reactive and have a lot of assumptions about something or thoughts about it, it's okay, just let it be. Just let it's going to exist. That's what's happening right now. That's mindfulness. Just this is what's happening in the present moment. It's loud. Meditation's not always quiet. And then going back to just observing. So that inner observer kind of gets strengthened over time through the practice of meditation or many other contemplative practices. Longtime practitioners of yoga, there's a body experiencing things like soreness or stretching or tightness, and then having a lot of feelings or responses about those experiences. And then there can be this observer that can be a more of a still or quiet one with more equanimity. It just says, it's okay that you can't get your nose on the floor in this pose. And the person next to you is like, has, rubber bands, infinite, suppleness, and you feel tight and just useless. It's okay. Just do the pose the way you can do the pose today. And so that, in yoga, there's that observer who's present. And then I think within coincidences, there can be that observer that notices. My observer really pinged on my earliest example of my friend in New Mexico when I looked online and saw he had just sent a post that was kind of an SOS, like I really need my friends to send me some support. And I'd just been thinking, like, I better check in. Wonder what's going on with him. So the observer part of me went, oh, wow, I wonder if I had that feeling at near the same time he made this post. And I did the math of as well as I could remember when I had this inclination, I should reach out and check on him. And I thought, yep, it's pretty close in time, probably before they got to the hospital when things were getting kind of scary. And so the observer kind of organized that experience a little bit for me and said, isn't that interesting? We are really connected, this friend and I. And I just kind of, redoubled my efforts to send my support to him and his mom. Also posted something to him at the time to just say how much I was thinking of
The
him.
observer, as you describe it, and I think it's true, puts together, in this case and other cases, it notices outside and inside when coincidences are involving both outside and inside parts of our thinking. So that it's that way of thinking about connecting outside with inside. And and you talked about strengthening the self-observer. I think that's an important phrase to elaborate on. You strengthen it by using it, and you start strengthening it by saying, it's there, I've got one. And this self-observer observes the self. It observes what's going on in one's mind, and that includes what can be observed by the mind of outside and inside. And meditation, I think, is what you're saying. Compassion, what you're saying, exercises the self-observer.
Yeah. I mean, and I think, another place that we can strengthen it is in therapy, that we're discussing and describing our moment to moment experiences and things that are ruminations, cycles and patterns of thought or experience that are repeating to a wise, other, the therapist, and they begin to narrate what they are observing about that. And that kind of can be a signal to our inner observer, oh, you could notice this too. You could notice that this often leads to that, and then it gets out of control. So if you notice it sooner, doesn't have to progress. You can just kind of still it before it leads to kind of a spiraling outcome.
I think that's an important observation, since I do therapy too, is that the therapist observer that somehow strengthens the individual observer, because the therapist can see it, and then the self can see it, the self-observer can see it too. So that's part of strengthening. I think another word is practicing it. Practice using your self-observer and recognizing it's there, and instead of just letting your self-observer be buried in the inundation of information that comes into us, as well as the obsessive thoughts that run around in our minds. We try to from that morass is get that self-observer out of there and say, hey, what's going on here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And, some people use journaling and reflective writing
Very good
to
way.
also
Very good way.
strengthen the voice and the accuracy of the observation of the observer. So we begin to narrate about our own experience and describing ourself as if ourself was an outside character. And then this happened, and then I went like this, or you could say she went like this. And so that narrative voice is another place that I think we potentially strengthen or cultivate that observer.
When you write the stuff down, it gets it out too. It's something like a therapist being out there and telling you back. So it gets it out, so then you could see it. So then you activate your self-observer, so you can see the same thing going on in your mind before someone else has to tell you, or the therapist, or you write it down.
Mm-hmm.
That's very useful concept, the self-observer. And we did talk about the collective self-observer, but I think I'd like to go to a second coincidence that happened between you and me, and get into some of the questions about how some of these coincidences happen. And this one is a good one to make some, I think, reasonable speculation about.
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead, Miss Trail. You're on.
Yeah. So just, like a couple weeks ago, I was coming over for us to work together. And I noticed a book lying on your kitchen table. And the cover of the book reminded me of the cover of another book. And the book you had on the table is Chase, Chance, and Creativity. But the art and color and even the texture of the cover reminded me of this book, Zen and the Brain, which is by James Austin.
Each of them.
Yeah, each of them is. So my first thought was, that looks just like the cover art of Zen and the Brain. I wonder if this is another book by Jim Austin. And then I thought, well, if it is, that's so weird, because I was just telling my brother about him earlier in the week. So my brother and I were having a conversation about longevity and living long lives and doing things that we need to do now to be healthy, to take care of ourselves so that we can, be very healthy and vigorous into long lives that humans can live into their 90s, their hundreds. Some of the longest lived people are living into between 110, 115 years of age. And so we were really musing on that. What do we need to do to be able to age that way? And I had met Jim Austin about 2017 at University of Virginia. He came to give a public talk for the Compassionate Care Initiative of the School of Nursing there. And they were the primary hosts, but the center I was working for was a co-host. And so it happened that after his talk, I escorted him halfway across the grounds of UVA, a nice long walk with hills and steps to climb, to have dinner of the host, the Dean of Nursing, at her home on the campus, on the grounds. And we had a nice conversation, and he enjoyed the walk so much. And I was just struck at the time by this person in their 90s who just gave a really thoughtful, insightful, cogent talk on neuroscience of meditation, Zen and the Brain. And I had learned, useful things from that talk. And then, we had this kind of vigorous walk together for dinner. And I thought, this is what I want to be like in the 90s, giving really insightful talks that obviously come from a highly intelligent person. And then taking a brisk walk and enjoying meeting new people and having an interesting dinner. That's what I want my 90s to look like. So I just told my brother this story about Jim Austin. And then I had the thought, after I talked to my brother, I thought, oh, I wonder how he's doing. I wonder if he's still out there. He must be something like 94 or 95 now, because that was several years ago. So back to the present moment of the story, I discover his other book I don't know about on your table.
Back to the present moment of the story, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a line from one of my songs. That's a good. Yeah.
And so then I go to look at the book. You and I have a bit of a conversation about that book. It is also written by him and has a middle section that you recommend that I read, that I now have on my reading to read list and table, on serendipity. And I didn't know he had also thought about coincidence and serendipity. I just was familiar with his Zen and the brain, neuroscience of contemplatives work. And so that was cool too. Yet another coincidence. Jim Austin studies both these two kinds of things I'm presently studying, which is thinking about the mind, the brain, and contemplation, and also thinking about serendipity and coincidence. And then the coincidence kept going. He lived where you lived. You worked at the same university. You were a department chair when he came, and spoke with him about perhaps taking a position on the faculty in your department. And Big joined the same tennis group. You started playing tennis together regularly and knew each other quite well socially. And then you mentioned like we could give him a call and see how he's doing. And I thought that we should definitely do that, because this is so strange, that you have all this history in Missouri with this person. I didn't even remember he lived in Missouri. I just experienced him on the grounds of University of Virginia in Charlottesville. So that was really my only point of reference. And it was just amazing that you had all of this history with this person. And I just casually narrated my experience of him to my brother a few days prior. And we did call him, and he is still doing well. And we had a nice, three-way conversation with him. He obviously knows you much better than he knew me. I was kind of an acquaintance he encountered briefly once, but he knew quite well. And we had a really interesting conversation, and he had a little gratitude he had wanted to share with you, because it turned out one of your administrators in that department became an editor for him on his books, and has been really helpful to him in all the books and the intellectual work he's been producing the last 20 years, 15 years. I couldn't tell the full length of time, but it was a substantive length of time. And he'd always wanted to tell you thanks, because I found that really helpful editor. I found her through you. And so it seemed like, Jim was also grateful for this coinciding of making the phone call, reaching out to him.
Yeah. It was fun talking with him, and you were there.
And at 95, he just put out yet another book.
I mean, and the sharpness of his mind was evident to both of us, as it has been, and it's even flexible. Because I brought up the possibility of stuff like simulpathity and telepathy to him. And he's pretty materialistic, but he loves the brain. He's a neurologist. Let's keep that in mind. I'm a psychiatrist. So he didn't join my department. He wanted neurology to be with neurology, but they didn't want him because he was too far out with his Buddhism, his Zen ideas. It's Japanese Zen that he was involved with.
Yeah.
So for the time we have left, and maybe there'll be more to talk about, but let's get into how you think this might have happened, this coincidence. But before that, let's talk about the other meaning of coincidence. Another common one is what did it mean to you for this coincidence to take place?
Well, you and I have experienced a number of coincidences.
Yes,
and
indeed.
It seems they often involve third parties that we both have experiences with. So over and over, it's like a little triangle gets created of relationship between you and me and some other party. And we discussed that previously. And so all of a sudden, Jim Austin pops in as one of those people that we share in common. Yours much more robust with a deeper history, mine much more transient. And yet we get to come together with him to check in on him at age 95 and discover he has another book that we then ordered so we can both read his new book on living Zen remindfully.
And let's do that again.
Yeah.
Living Zen remindfully. Not mindfully, remindfully. And we don't know what that means, or at least I don't.
No, we're going to have to read the book.
Here we're talking about mindfulness. So remindfulness, and it hasn't been delivered yet, so we're going to find out what that means. So he wrote that book, and he thought I'd like it because why? Well, there was something in there about chickens. There's Hanukkah chickens or something.
I don't know. We'll have to read it to find out.
Butterflies more, or birds or something.
Animal coincidences or something, some pattern.
Yeah, maybe. So he thought I'd be interested in it. Because
Yeah.
for me, those Zen and the Zen and the mind and the brain were hard to read, and I know
Mhm.
something about the brain, so it was well thought about, a lot of research in it, but I couldn't really do them very well. But this one,
Yeah.
he says, is more accessible. So what
Mm.
you're saying is that it's another triangle that you and I have, um, that now that's how that's your meaning of it.
Maybe, it was such an interesting coincidence that, I mean, that was just one that it pinged on. Well, Bernie and I, this happens with us. We find ourselves, talk about Kurt Vonnegut's concept of the karass, the people that are sort of meant to be entangled with, that we have these strands of life, and that there's people that are gonna that are part of the same family of strands, and therefore multiple brushings with other strands, other people, are going to be in common for them. And there seems to be something to that, which maybe gets to that notion of the collective that we kind of touched on but didn't explore a lot earlier. The group, we go from individual to group, that there's some sort of meaningful group, and the group can help us get to think about the collective.
And, and it's probably more than even the collective human organism, which we've touched on. But there's this phrase called Indira's net. I think it's Indian, but it might not be. But other things about the net that coincidences alert us to the existence of. There is a net that we're all part of, and a worldwide net is a materialistic manifestation of a larger net of which we're all part. And these parts are manifested, the sections are manifested through coincidences like this. It's one way of
Mm-hmm.
thinking about it.
Yep.
Another way that but I was involved with this too, so it's important to recognize that coincidences are not often just about you, lady. It's all about me, gentlemen. It's all about us. That the two people are involved. There's a tendency to just think about what it means to me when there's a second person involved. But it's important to put the second person in your mind when you're the one reporting it, as you are. So I'm a second person in this. You're the one who could
Mm-hmm.
make the coincidence evident, being as you
Mm-hmm.
had seen him before. But I then became part of it, so it became a coincidence for me too. So as a coincidence for me too, what did that mean? Well, it strengthened my relationship with Jim Austin to have that happen. I had been thinking about him for the couple of days up until we did that, and thinking about calling him. But you were the trigger to have me do that, and what better trigger than you, given what has just happened? It kind of just was a culmination of something I was getting ready to do, the same way your brother and you were talking about longevity and got to Jim Austin through that. The connection was that you saw his book and you got his book, and I had his book, so that helped
Mm-hmm.
make you think about him some
Mm-hmm.
more. I don't know how independently you would have talked about longevity with your brother about it and brought him into it. We just don't know how to answer that. But for me, it was first it's fun. I I I like coincidences, so they're enjoyable. So
Mm-hmm.
I got a kick out of it. What it helped me do is link up with the serendipity again. I very much appreciate opportunities to connect with people who are studying some of these things that of synchronicity, serendipity, coincidences, simulpathity. And he'd written an interesting section in that book for me, and it was one of the first I had seen. And I've gotten different ideas about it from than what's in there, but he's still got a very interesting categorization. So it meant for me highlighting what I had read about him, because it made it more from him. It made it more real again. Just talk to the guy who'd written something, and I could even tell him about a book about the travels and adventures of serendipity, the word that he'd never heard of. And it's a wonderful linguistic essay of starting with serendipity and Walpole's definition of it, and how he started, where he got the word from, and how from 1780 something or other, that word has traveled and had gone through many changes, through bibliophiles to artists to writers to science, and where serendipity is big, especially in medical science. Serendipity is the best way to, is the most common way of finding things, and that Nobel Prize winners often tell people, I didn't do this with straight laboratory research with doing some protocol thing. Something weird happened, and there it was. That's how, and then I recognized that it was something worthwhile. And if you look at Nobel Prize winners' descriptions, you'll see that much more often. And science doesn't like that. Medical science doesn't like that. So he was going against the grain of regular science, and he was a good scientific researcher in neurology. So that became another part of what was strong to me. But let's go to how it happened, because like the simulpathity one, and I think there's a relationship between the two of them, that the simulpathity one and this Jim Austin serendipity one with you and me have a way of being explained, perhaps in a similar way. How would you start that discussion?
Well, what I learned in talking with you about your experience of that coincidence is that several days prior, you'd pulled out his book and started rereading his section on serendipity and begun thinking, I should give him a call. So he was on your mind. And then I had a conversation about health and well-being and longevity with my brother. And I think to tell my brother, oh, let me tell you about Jim Austin, who I met once at the age of 91. And why did I randomly think about Jim Austin? And perhaps it was because you and I are so closely connected that the resonance of your thoughts was somehow influencing or impacting the resonance of my thoughts. And so that's why I plucked Jim Austin, of all things, out of the universe of everyone I've ever met. And I tell his story to my brother about the same time you're reading his work again, thinking about him and your personal relationship to him, and specifically thinking about reaching out and making contact with him. And in that conversation with my brother, I thought, I wonder if I'll ever talk to him or know about him again to know how he's doing right now.
You did put that question out there.
I had that thought. I didn't say it to my brother, but that was after I spoke of Jim to my brother. The last thought I had was, I wonder how he's doing now. He must be 94, 95. Yeah. And I wonder if I'll ever encounter this person again, because that seems so unlikely. And yet you were also thinking about encountering, and for you, it's not at all unlikely. You've known each other well, played tennis together, had each other's phone numbers. He recognized your number as you rang, and he said, oh, is that Bernard Beitman? As soon as he picked up the phone. So he knew it was you.
That he did.
Yeah. So perhaps the coincidence, the causality actually started with you. And I would never have known that if we hadn't both explored what this coincidence was like for each of us.
And we have to then make another assumption that people who share a strong relationship, both emotionally and perhaps, as with you and me, intellectually, make something happen that allows for the transmission of ideas between us in ways that are not generally accepted by current science. And it's a form of telepathy, but it's more kind of living in the same kind of thought world and having minds that aren't as separate as we think they are, that our minds are moving around and overlapping and separating and having all kinds of things happening in a dynamic way that allows sometimes for some thoughts to cross over into one of our subconscious from the other, and then become a little more activated because of the emotion I had and thinking about him, and that got emotion going in you as a sensitive subject in you. So it popped up in your consciousness to talk enough about your brother. And this idea that we can be connected brings us to the theme song we started with today. The psychosphere is our mental atmosphere, is the way that song starts, and it is called the psychosphere. And I hypothesize the existence of our mental atmosphere in which from which we breathe in, like oxygen and carbon dioxide. We breathe in ideas and we breathe out ideas, or breathe in energy information is what I call it, and breathe it out. And there's energy information floating around all around in this psychosphere, and that each of us has a representation of our minds in the psychosphere. And those representations I like to call the spheres of the psychosphere, the sphericals of the psychosphere. So there's your mind and there's my mind, and each of our minds is connected to our earth minds. And the strength of the connection in the earth minds influences the transmission potential in the psychosphere of the psychosphere sphericals, so that we were able to do this connection up there, that allowed us to then have this coincidence take place. And I think the same thing happened with your friend in New Mexico. You had a bond, earth-mind bonds. He got more emotional. You became, and your spheres became closer as you could detect and he could send out some kind of SOS, some signal, and that you had a feeling that you needed to be able to react to him. This is a diagram that will deserve further elaboration, but I think we are illustrating the song in this way, and the concept in this way, and we'll end this segment will end with the psychosphere to alert you, the audience, to its existence and the possibility that your minds, like ours, are represented in the psychosphere and have information and energy coming from the psychosphere as well as out there. So we're coming to the end of our show today, Juliet. It went pretty fast.
It did. Can I add one little example for our listeners?
That's why I'm giving you this intro right here. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I think that the impact of our minds in the psychosphere, it's also a little bit of a beacon, like sending out a radio signal of thought, of inspiration. And all of a sudden, one person will begin a work of art, and then they look up the newest, issue of the art periodical they subscribe to. There's an almost identical work of art published, and they're almost done with their piece, but it's not quite out. My college boyfriend wrote a story that had the exact same premise as The Matrix. And I'd already read the story before we went to see the movie The Matrix. And we sat there watching the movie The Matrix and looking at each other and looking at The Matrix. He called his story The Ghost in the Machine. So the ghost in the machine was this kind of, avatar world inside the Matrix. And it was just like, you already wrote this story, but they're doing a really good job with the story. There's a book by Elizabeth Gilbert called Big Magic, where she talks about the magic of an inspiration coming to you and you kind of saying, go away, I don't have time for you. And then you find someone years later took up that same inspiration idea and manifested it. And so it does exist in the world. She said, it's almost as if these ideas, these creative notions or inspirations are almost their own entities in the psychosphere. And they're knocking on our thought door going, hey, let me in. I want you to think me and I want you to make me. I want to exist. And not just be an idea. I want to be manifested. And you think, I just can't. And then it goes to someone else and knocks on their door. And maybe that's how simultaneous discovery or simultaneous creation in art has a little more of an explanation if we think about it that way. Yeah. And, and it's just this resonance or ripple effect that our thought kind of floats out there. So, Bernie had a real ping on Jim Austen that week. And maybe there's like 5 or 6 people connected to you that had, for some reason, Jim Austen occurred to them that week in some way. And if we were all kind of talking about our coincidence stories, maybe we would discover them. You and I were together when this coincidence happened, so then we talked about it. But maybe there's other ways, that these things that we ping on then ping to other, signal towers, other sphericals in the psychosphere. Both those of people we're closely related to, but maybe also just random, people that for whatever reason pick up that signal.
Oh yeah, I think that random thing is worth, but what's random anyway? But that's a subject. That's a subject for for another time. But
But
that's
not closely related, people that haven't met, for example, to create that connection between
yeah.
their thought spheres.
Yeah, and then how are they really not closely related becomes a question.
Right.
It's I love random
More
because
for
it's
another time.
and random is just so random. I mean, it's just so whatever it is. So we're coming to the end of our show. We've been talking with Juliet Trail, who is the founder of Creative Compassion. Oh, Juliet, I always forget.
So many
Courageous,
C's.
Courageous Compassion Connection.
There you go.
And also my great colleague in the as the managing director of the Coincidence Project, which we'll get into another time. Thank you very much for being on the show, and we'll come back to the to our listening audience because this was only the first in this new series on connecting with coincidence. I am your host, Bernard Beitman, MD.
This psychosphere is our mental atmosphere, like a hologram of cosmic consciousness.